¿Está abierto el micrófono? Sí, gracias. Muy buenas tardes. Quiero darle la bienvenida a esta sesión de este magno evento en el que agradecemos a todos ustedes su presencia y en especial a quienes van a ser panelistas de esta sesión dedicada al análisis, el estudio, al debate de la movilidad social. Les presento al profesor François.
I would like to introduce Professor François Bourguignon, who is an emeritus professor from the School of Economy in Paris. Welcome, Professor Bourguignon. Thank you very much. I would like to introduce Ms. Katrina Williams. She is also a very distinguished panel member, and currently she is in charge of the Commission for Social Mobility and Children Poverty of the United Kingdom. We would like to thank her for her attendance and the trip, in particular such a long trip that they had to take to come here. And we would like to thank our colleague, Dr. Enrique Cárdenas Sánchez, who is the executive director of the Center of Studies called Espinosa Iglesias in Mexico. As you can see, guided by the professional profile of our guest, we have a wide range of expertise and very good quality regarding this topic of social mobility. From the get-go, we see a perspective that includes a vision from Europe, in particular the presentations from Katrina and François, and also we will hear a reflection on the situation here in Mexico provided by Professor Enrique Cárdenas. As an opening statement, I would like to underscore that in this forum, the relationship between statistics and knowledge and public policies, that's the main core of the topic today. Without a doubt, from what we've heard, statistics has advanced a lot in several countries, and we've had the opportunity to witness that through INEGI. Statistics has advanced. The knowledge that we have on the indexes for social development in Mexico have reached a level of excellence that is extraordinary, and that has made it easier for us to get a better knowledge of the social situation of the country on critical topics, just as inequality and also social issues, and we can now approach it in a different way. Just a while ago, we were presented with the development as per state, but taking advantage of the statistical information from the country, it is possible to now do it with regions, specialized regions, and especially what we gather from our data, we can get better information from INEGI. What I mean by all of this is that statistics has advanced tremendously, and knowledge has advanced as well. And maybe a very important topic includes policies and institutions, and the advances in those areas has been a little slower if we consider the results for national development. That's especially in the topic of poverty. That has been one of the biggest challenges for our nation from the very beginning, and we haven't solved that problem yet. I would like to start with this statement. That's data number one, and the data number two would be learning from international experiences and from mobility, social mobility, the debate of its characteristics in societies, may them be developed or underdeveloped societies. It raises a discussion here on how to define social mobility, where is it expressed, how can we measure social mobility, and what are the factors that have promoted this mobility, or what have been the brakes that have kept us from advancing further and achieving better equality in social terms in all of the societies that make us up. Without a doubt, social mobility and social inequality are intertwined. All of these problematics are intertwined. How can we raise the quality of life of our societies? And in particular, if we focus in the concept of social mobility, just as it was mentioned a while ago, we may debate what's the scale, what's the measuring point, what are going to be the tools to measure it, and once again, what are those driving forces that for that social mobility, that something that can help us attain better social levels. In some areas, it is worse than in others. Well, that's the main scenario. I would like to just share with you the order that I have in my program. I would like to invite Enrique Sanchez so that he can start his presentation. Good evening. Thank you very much for the OECD and also the National Institute of Statistics, INEGI, for the invitation to this excellent forum. I, without a doubt, am very much honored to be here with you today. The topic that I would like to cover here today is the topic of social mobility and well-being in Mexico. Some basic aspects regarding the diagnosis and some recommendations. Basically, what we would like to cover today are the following topics. First of all, how can we define social mobility in the studies that we do? Some of these data, these main data that we've found, and later we would go into the main determinants of social mobility on the side of supply in the market and also the demand side. And we would emphasize education in the first area and productivity, income and growth on the demand side. Finally, some proposals for public policies, but not only public policies, as we will see, but also social actions that I would like to share with you and tell you why. Then, social mobility can be defined as how easily a person can move in the socioeconomic scale. This means how much are we determined in life by our birth. And it is truly an accident, our birth, because as I say it, when we are born, when we know that we are brought to our families, it depends where we land. And where it is that we land when we are born is going to determine our future. And sometimes it's hard to determine what is going to be our future. Why is this important? Well, because this would be a very unjust situation. And social mobility is important because we would like to see social achievements and professional achievements be the main determinants of their destiny, not so much their background or where it is that they were born. Also, we believe that social mobility should be promoted, mainly because of justice, meritocracy. This means that the effort shall be the one taken into account. And also it is going to allow for better social cohesion, less perception of injustice. It is going to improve the social context, and also it is a topic of efficiency. This means that if talent is distributed in a normal shape, statistically speaking, those people who were lucky or unlucky when they were born, their talent won't be taken to its full potential. And not only that person, their family, but also the whole country is going to experience a loss. We are going to lose the potential of that person, that human capital. The data that I'm about to present come from the second survey for social mobility from the study center Espinosa Iglesias. The survey is called ESRU for social mobility. The first one was in the year 2006. The second one was in the year 2011. This is a national survey. The features of this survey is that it is a retrospective survey. The people were asked about their household, their origin. It is impossible to know how much their parents made economically. However, we try and assess how many possessions they had, how many actives, whether or not they had a house, whether or not they had a bathroom, whether they had a car or not. And those are the questions that we ask, and we ask about the current situation of that person surveyed as well. This survey included 11,000 questionnaires, and it has people including both males and females. Usually these types of surveys do not divide or not always make divisions or make a representative sample for both males and females. What the heads of the households? What are the results? Well, first of all, we would like to do an international comparison. Here I'm taking into account 20% of the population that is born in a poor income household. What happens 20, 30 years afterwards? Well, in Mexico, 48% of those who are born in the first quintile, the poorest quintile, they remain there one generation afterwards. This means there is very little permeability in that sense. If we take a look at other countries, Chile is 34%, United States 42%, and the United Kingdom up to 30%. That's the data that we have insofar. And some countries from Scandinavia have greater mobility. If we break this down, this 48%, and see it specifically for Mexico, not for other countries, out of that first quintile, we know that 48% remains there, 22% go to the next quintile, 14% to the third, 11% to the fourth, and only 4% can reach the first quintile in this distribution. This is the information that we have, and as you can see, this is very interesting data, because if you analyze this, if we only consider the first and the second quintile, those are very similar in terms of income, then we would see that 7 out of 10 people being born in the first quintile remain there. This would include a society that when you're born, no matter what you do, you're going to stay where you were born. And that is a very important problem. What happens on the other side of the distribution? Those people who are born on the richer quintile. Well, there is low permeability there as well. You can see 52% remain in that fifth quintile, and 26% goes down to the fourth quintile. Only 3% falls all the way to the first quintile. This means this is not very permeable in both ends of the distribution. I'm not going to present the whole matrix, it would be too much information, but in the middle quintiles, there is much more permeability. The situation is a little bit stickier in those quintiles. Now, in terms of occupation, we have a very similar situation. We see people who are born in the first quintile, 28% do agriculture type businesses, 25% have low manual qualification, 26% are high in manual qualification, and then the following generation gets a little bit more sophisticated, and only 7%, only 1% in this case, reaches non-manual high qualification types of activities. Not only in terms of income, but also in terms of occupation, we don't have that much permeability in our society. And what happens in terms of gender? Well, in terms of gender, we see that, sadly, women are in the worst possible situation. There is permeability, but it's not as high as we would want it to be. Why is that? Well, because on one side, women who are born in the first quintile of this distribution, for them it is much more difficult to get out of that situation. It is harder for women than for men in this case. The situation was hard on its own, but it's harder for women. Well, those who are born in the richer quintile, it's easier for them to fall from that quintile for women than men. So as you can see, we have more mobility, but the wrong type of mobility. And now we are going to see very quickly some of the determinants, and one of them would be education for this social mobility from the supply side in the labor market. We can say that there may be more determinants, but I would like to focus on three: education, health, and pensions, naturally. In terms of education, we know that education as a principle is the main drive, main source for social mobility. That's what we've heard from the sessions today and from also yesterday, how education is the utmost important without a doubt. But what happens for those who are born in the poor quintile? Well, as it turns out, 11% who are born in the poorest quintile, the highest degree of education, well, they don't have an education. 11% don't even reach elementary school grade, incomplete primary school, and only 33% have an elementary school grade, 16% secondary, 6% upper secondary, and 5% reach a university. So you are born in the lowest quintile, and barely 11% can reach either high school or university out of those born in that quintile. And on the other hand, we see that those people who are born in the highest quintile, well, they at least go into high school, most of them. 33% undergo university studies, 33% high school, 19% secondary, and from then it goes down, the percentages. Almost none of them don't have an education or no schooling. This is going to determine how far you're going to study. So if you are born poor, you are going to have a harder time to reach at least the high school level. But as it turns out, we know that there is a positive relationship between the scholarity or the degree of education that you have and the income level. And it becomes much more important when you reach high school degree or university degree. Before those degrees, the income levels are very similar, and that's what's happening right now. So as it turns out, if poor people cannot reach further than middle school, they are going to only receive an income equal to middle school. And if they reach university, they are going to have a higher income. So an educational system that does not provide enough quality, or that does not provide equal opportunities for everyone so that they can reach as high as they can out of their effort and their merit, then they are going to be condemned to inequality. This means that they are perpetuating inequality only on the basis of this path. If we, from the health side and pensions side, we can imagine that it's not in the slide, but one can see how not having the right type of healthcare system can lead to very serious problems in terms of mobility. Pensions or insurances for any type of accident or damage, those people who are at risk, they are going to go back to poverty very easily. And that's usually what we see. I'm not going to go into deep with that with data, but I just want you to take that idea. If we go into the demand side, we also have some very important topics there, because no matter the case, those people who go out and work, let's say that they are well trained. Well, the economy has to catch them in a way, has to offer either the job for them and have that job be or have a good type of salary. Well, what we've seen is that the productivity has been stagnant in the last few years, and it is no longer a source of growth as it was in the 50s, 60s, or even 70s, but it is more of a weight that is decreasing that growth, and therefore the growth is no longer positive, it is negative, and we need to enter more and more in order to get less. Therefore, income is stagnant just as well. If productivity is stagnant, then the medium income is stagnant just as well. This is a graph for the last 25, no, even more, 60 years, the last 60 years in terms of the sources for economic growth. And as you can see, from the last 25 years, productivity has been stagnant. And it is something that you see reflected in real income being stagnant as well. This is income in pesos for the year 2015, according to the National Service from 1992 to the year 2014. this is divided by quintiles. And independently of the levels, you can see that those levels, all of them are very much plain. They are stagnant. So we see a situation where productivity being stagnant, income becomes stagnant, and we also see a phenomenon that is trying to figure out what's happening. And what we find is the following. The education system is disconnected from the production system. What does this mean? Well, the years of education in the country has been increasing in the last 35 years. This is the blue curve. As you can see, education is growing in the number of years. We have an average of 10 years of schooling. However, the productivity, as you can see here, has been growing in delayed pattern. This means one would expect that if you have more years of schooling, if you have more human capital, then you would expect productivity to rise in the same pace. But we don't see that. Productivity is disconnected from what's happening in the educational level in general. The second part of this is that productivity, the one that we have, is very unequal. It is unequal at the level of the companies and the level of sectors and in regions. And therefore, it is something that has been mentioned here. We have two Mexicos, probably 3 or 4 Mexicos, but there are very two clear Mexicos. And we start to see the relationship between low social mobility, how inequality goes on, and therefore there is polarization, social and economic polarization. I was showing you these graphs before, and as you could see, productivity wasn't growing, it was already plain, and there is lack of social mobility. And as you can see in this graph, how the growth rate for the states in the last 10 years as an average is very different. Those in yellow and in orange are those states from our country that have grown over 3%. Those in orange are over 4%, and in blue 2 to 3%, and less than 2% in dark green. Without a doubt, we see regions, and not only at the regional level, but let's now analyze it in terms of GDP growth. In the last 15 years, you can see that those states in the north are systematically growing in terms of GDP, 1 percentage point above those states in the south. When you see this information throughout these 15 years, you start seeing 2 different countries. And you can notice here how the origin of that divide. One wonders, why is it that the country, the whole country, is not growing at 5%, just as the state of Querétaro or the state of Baja California or other states? 4.5 up to 5% in 15 years. They've managed to grow 5 years, and that's transforming those regions. Then let's go to the proposals for public policies. That's what I would like to share with you, and they are derived from the previous aspects. I am going to divide them in 2 aspects, the public policies and what we are looking to attain is prosperity and to have social inclusion. We want to build a fairer and more cohesive society. What we see is that we need to establish a common ground, a common beginning, so that the opportunities are the same for everyone, and avoid this strategy that is depending of the situation that you're born in. And this is going to be influenced through a wide fiscal base and a more equitable fiscal regime. This means that we need not forget the finance part, and we have some very straightforward proposals for that. And on the other hand, what this includes is that we need to transform education, health, and pension systems towards having better quality and having them be sustainable in the long term. One core element is the implementation of policies that are consistent of the universalization of the whole population. We want to have equal opportunities for everyone. And also we want to establish an environment that promotes investment and growth, economic growth. I would like to also say that at our institution we believe, according to the report that is presented, there is a report on social mobility right outside on the stand in Spanish and in English if you want to access that. We agree that we need to establish social mobility as a priority in the public agenda. It is not enough to combat poverty. It is not enough to combat inequality. But if we see it through different generations, that it was mentioned this morning, it is much more powerful in order to build a prosperous society and an inclusive society. What we also want to do is we want to promote a good education. That's what is going to carry you forward. We don't want to take this to the authorities, but to the young people and those families that need to do their work. And that's what we are promoting right now. And finally, something that I think is very important and is probably the most recent. What we want to do is we want companies and civil organizations to incorporate financing agencies and incorporate elements within their structure that include social mobility. And I would like to give you an example on that. Imagine that companies, those big companies, not only do they have to do with their employees, sometimes they can reward the children of their employees that have very good grades, for instance. Or maybe they can have some kind of promotion, maybe make sure that everyone has a minimal income. And in doing so, they can start looking forward. Sometimes microfinancing become traps for poverty. When a credit allows a family to, let's say, establish a small business, but never get out of that small business, and then you have the children, the grandmother, and the whole family in charge of that small business, that business is going to remain there. What we want to do is we want to give them social mobility elements so that at least the children can move forward in the next generation. And we believe that the organizations play a very important role in that. The three main conclusions that I would like to share with you today are: social mobility in Mexico is very low. There is a trap of education. If we don't have the right system in education, a system that allows for more productivity, we need to create that environment that is going to catch that labor market that is growing. And finally, we consider in our institution that it is important to have a social policy, that it be a state policy, where there is universal social protection system for everyone. We want it to be equal for everyone and with good funding. And finally, yes, we want both public and private institutions, especially private institutions, we want to invite them to promote social mobility. Thank you very much. We would like to thank Enrique for his presentation regarding the diagnosis. I believe that it was very well made. And I would like to go into the question session, but I would like to leave three main topics to discuss later on. First, in this stagnant point of mobility in Mexico, are we moving towards a stagnant society? Is that a risk? I would like to reflect on that later on. The second aspect is whether or not in this scenario, the indigenous population that represents more or less 10%, has been the population that is the most forgotten. And they are at the extremes of inequality and at the extremes of social mobility. What would happen to that population? And the third one is the international mobility. Right now, Mexico, 10% of its population is living in the United States, and a big amount of that population has been moving in the years that you just mentioned. What would have happened if that hadn't happened? Or what is the scenario for the future? What is going to happen? We would probably need to take that migration into account. I would like to leave these 3 points up for reflection. Now I would like to invite Katrina Williams to present her presentation. Bueno, muchas
me to speak today. I wanted to tell you a bit about the work of the Social Mobility Child Poverty Commission in the UK. The Social Mobility and Child Poverty Commission is an advisory, non-departmental public body, and it was established under legislation. The Commission has a board of 9 commissioners, of which I am one, and the chair and its vice chair were previously government ministers, but of different parties. One, the previous health minister from the Labour Party, and the vice chair, a previous education minister from the Conservative Party. The rest of us, the other 7, I should say, come from business, academia, and the NGO sector. The role of the Commission is specifically in relation to social mobility and child poverty, but today I'll just talk about the child poverty, the social mobility part. The role is to monitor the government's progress in improving social mobility in the United Kingdom. It's to provide independent published advice to ministers at their request, including about the measurement of socio-economic disadvantage and social mobility. And it's also to challenge the government institutions such as higher education, business and others to improve their performance on social mobility, and that's been referred to by the previous speaker. The Commission, since it came into being in 2013, has issued over 25 reports, and they're all available on the website. Our priority is actually to check on the reality of social mobility in the UK. And in this short space of time, I'll try and give you a flavour of the work that we've done so far. It's been a deeply held belief in the UK that everyone should have a fair chance in life. Yet too often, demography is destiny in our country. Being born poor often leads to a lifetime of poverty. Poor schools ease people into poor jobs. Disadvantage and advantage cascade down through the generations, as was said previously. Over decades, we've become a wealthier society, but we've struggled to become a fairer one. In the Commission's second annual State of the Nation report, our central conclusion was that Britain is on the brink of becoming a permanently divided nation, and that governments would have to adopt a radical new approach if poverty is to be beaten and social mobility improved. We came to that conclusion because while the economy started to strengthen with record numbers of people going into work, the economic recovery was not being matched by a social recovery. The gap between the haves and the have-nots is growing ever wider. Britain has one of the lowest social mobility levels in the developed world. The salary you earn is much more likely to be linked to what your father got paid than to any other major country. So we looked at elitist Britain. Lack of progress at the bottom is mirrored by lack of movement at the top. In the Commission's study of 4,000 people in Britain in the leading professions, it showed that Britain is still deeply elitist, when over 60% of senior military officers, 50% of senior civil servants, 40% of senior journalists, 30% of cabinet ministers, 20% of shadow cabinet ministers, when they all came from private schools, when that compares with 7% of the population. It's hard to avoid the conclusion that there remains a closed shop at the top of British society. Those who wield power and influence in our society come largely from schools that only educate 7% of our population. There is similarly a skewed picture if you look at higher education. We calculated the figures in relation to Oxford and Cambridge, and as you can see, the figures there are dramatic but not surprising. 75% of our judges, 59% of the cabinet, 57% of permanent secretaries, senior civil servants, etc., etc. And yet Oxford and Cambridge educate less than 1% of people who pass through higher education in the UK. Turning to educational outcomes, we compared the performance of bright and less bright children, analysed in terms of the background of their parents. What this slide shows is that by the age of 10, the performance of less bright children with high status parents has overtaken the performance of bright children from lower socioeconomic groups. In terms of performing well in school tests at the age of 10, you are more likely to do well if you are a less able child brought up by professional parents than if you are a bright child, a clever child, brought up by parents who are not professionals. The attainment gap is equally marked and equally persistent at age 16. In relation to poverty, this graph compares the relative performance of children eligible for free school meals, which in the UK tends to be used as one of the measures of disadvantaged children. So the relative performance of children eligible for free school meals with those not eligible for free school meals in terms of achieving 5 grade A to C exam results, GCSE results, including English and maths. So this is what was compared. The performance for both groups has improved since 2004, but the gap in performance has remained pretty constant. So if we move then on to higher education, there's been a clearer improvement, but the gap is still pretty significant. The trend indicated on the graph promises continued improvement, but even if this is delivered, you are still twice as likely to go to university if you are born in more favourable socioeconomic circumstances. And in relation to the most prestigious institution, the results even worse. The Russell Group is a group of universities who are self-selected on the basis of on the basis of their entry standards for students. The number of state school pupils attending Russell Group universities increased between 1997 and 2003, but it hasn't changed very much since then. The trend for pupils from low participation areas follows a similar pattern, while the bottom line, representing working class pupils, actually shows a decline over the period. Moving on to our Cracking the Code report. This last slide was just really another illustration of the working class access to those prestigious universities not really improving. So this report, Cracking the Code, we decided, we were always looking at problems, but what about looking at trying to find some solutions? We decided to look at the schools which are actually bucking the trend to prove that deprivation doesn't have to be the destiny, so that we can better understand how other schools might follow the example of schools that are achieving outcomes. The key roles schools can play, as many of you in this esteemed audience know, is that they can account for 20% of difference in educational outcomes. They can help fulfill their potential in what attracts people to teaching. And I think that's something we don't actually think about. Why do teachers want to teach? What is their motivation for their job satisfaction? And finally, there is also a business case for schools to deliver for all pupils. However, unequal outcomes at every stage. Educational outcomes in the UK are unequal at every stage. At age 5, children from the poorest backgrounds are more than a year behind their richer peers when they start school. That is one of the statistics that really worries me as a person very much involved in child welfare. By the time you go to school, you're a year behind at age 5. Now, that is quite difficult to catch up. At age 11, 2 in 5 children eligible for free school meals fail to reach basic standards in reading and maths at age 11. And age 16, 3 in 5 children fail to get 5 good GCSEs, twice as many as other children. Of course, there are regional differences. The poorest children in England have done considerably better in their GCSEs over the last decade, but the most significant increases have been in London, and particularly at higher levels of attainment. Poor children in inner London are 50% more likely to get 5 good GCSEs and 3 times more likely to get top grades than children elsewhere. It's quite interesting, and we could go into this at another time, the London phenomenon. Research has shown that the London effect is due to demographics, but not all of it. So it's quite a complex situation. But success isn't actually confined to London. Disadvantaged children outperform the national average in 1 in 3 of our primary schools and 1 in 8 of our secondary schools. I won't dwell on this slide because it's a little bit complicated to explain, but basically it's showing that, that there is a lot to be learnt from the strongest schools who are achieving a lot with a high proportion of children from socially disadvantaged backgrounds, and the variations between the educational outcomes between schools across the UK was actually very worrying in terms of their cohorts of children who were attending. So what we concluded was that if schools close the gap with the top 20% of similar schools, we'd have 15,000 more students who'd get 5 good GCSEs each year. I'll now move on to employment. The poshness test. I don't know if that poshness is a word that's universally translatable, but the poshness test to us means people who have got a huge amount of opportunities and advantages. This research looked at barriers faced by applicants from less privileged socioeconomic backgrounds in entering elite law and accountancy firms, and you referred to businesses. What we found was that elite law and accountancy firms continued to be dominated by people from more privileged backgrounds. These firms focused their recruitment efforts on a narrow selection of elite universities. Employers interpret talent in a way that favours people from a more privileged background by considering style, accent, mannerisms, and even what countries you've travelled to. Even when people from non-traditional backgrounds enter these elite professions, evidence suggests that they're not rewarded financially as highly as their more advantaged peers. Our recommendations are that elite firms should aim to record a wide range of social mobility indicators for new entrants. Elite firms should increase transparency by publishing headline data on their diversity efforts, and they should extend coaching and support to students beyond preferred universities. Despite an increase in resource costs, this presents an opportunity for elite firms to work together, and they should offer more mentoring opportunities for students from less privileged backgrounds. This is a very sensitive area. I have 3 children grown up. I tried to help them. I helped them get work experience. I helped them with this, that and the other. A lot of parents who have professional backgrounds do that. We have had a very interesting example, which perhaps in the debate later I can talk about, with PricewaterhouseCoopers, a big international company. One of the commissioners is from PricewaterhouseCoopers, and they changed their practice. They hadn't realized that they were so narrow in their recruitment practices. I'll now turn to downward mobility, opportunity, hoarding at the higher end, and the glass floor. This research compared children of different cognitive abilities and their achievement in later life, finding that social background can be a stronger determinant for future success than ability. Within high and low attainment groups, children from families with higher incomes or more advantaged social class backgrounds have a greater chance of being highly successful in the labour market than their less advantaged peers. Parental education plays a large role in determining a child's future success in their careers. And high-attaining children from less advantaged backgrounds, income or social class, are less likely to be in a high-earning or top job as an adult. Entering work, young people in the UK, we're particularly concerned about the 16 to 25-year-olds, very, very concerned. The current system for helping young people, however, transition from school to work is very complex and not sustainable. As the financial crisis eases, it is actually the right time to develop a solution. We have challenges remaining with us. We've got a lot of young people who need to get into good quality work. We have got a situation where the economy is beginning to improve. We have got jobs that are coming into creation, but they're not necessarily well-paid jobs. So what we decided in our State of the Nation report was that challenges exist. Disadvantaged children, however, are still over twice as likely to be unemployed or inactive. Long-term youth unemployment is still double the level it was in the UK before the recession. And this matters because young people have been disproportionately impacted in the UK, and this isn't popular, the Commission wasn't popular when it said it, they've been disproportionately impacted on compared to the older generations. The challenges remain. Access to universities, despite current trends, you'll still be twice as likely to enter university if you're advantaged compared to being disadvantaged. Access to the top universities, more advantaged, you're 6 times more likely to go to one of the other universities. Now the challenges remain. What we've got is a glass floor. We've got a situation in the UK where something really has got to be done. Our recommendation to the UK government was that this social mobility has got to be researched in much greater depth, and in terms of perception as well, which was referred to in the plenary session, how people perceive whether they have got a poverty of aspiration. The social mobility reality is there in terms of statistics. We were actually heartened in the Prime Minister's speech last week, where he actually said to the Conservative Party conference that there is one big issue that has to be dealt with as well as poverty in the UK, and that is social mobility. That you can't have a society where children and young people have no aspiration and they're not able to achieve, either to have an aspiration because of intergenerational changes, or to be able to achieve what they want to fulfill their lives and for the whole of society to raise up. So I know it sounds a rather sort of gloomy presentation here, but it's meant to be something that can be worked on and developed and actually get to the root cause of what is happening in the UK, and I hope some of the messages will be transferable to the rest of you. Thank you. Thank you.
Muchas gracias a Katrina Williams por esa presentación.
Thank you very much, Katrina Williams, for your presentation on the educational system in the United Kingdom and the role of young people. We have some questions that without a doubt we are going to answer in a minute. Thank you very much. We would like to continue with Professor François Bourguignon. Thank you very much, Professor. We are listening.
Tengo una presentación.
I have a presentation, but I have no clicker. Okay, there it is.
Okay, espero que
Very well. I hope that For the people in the audience, the ones who attended the previous session, I hope that you don't get tired of hearing me. But I swear that what I'm about to say is different to what I said before in the previous session. It won't be the same. But just like before, I am going to switch into English.
This presentation could be a kind of annex to what Joe Stiglitz said in the morning. I mean, you will remember that he talked very much about inequality of opportunities versus inequality of income or outcomes. And I would like to look at social mobility as an entry point in this discussion about the role of inequality of opportunities versus inequality of outcomes. And I will try to summarize the way in which we have to think about these two aspects of inequality, which is quite important in shaping the kind of policy that we would like to implement in order to reduce inequality in general and at the same time to improve social mobility and the inequality of opportunity in the equality of opportunities. Okay, so the first question, when you look at the literature on inequality, there is this kind of opposition between people who tell you what matters is the inequality of opportunity and people who are telling you what matters is the inequality of income. And basically there are various strands of philosophical thought behind that. People who are egalitarian and to some extent radical would say what matters is really the equality of outcome, the equality of the resources people have to live with. And then there is an alternative moral philosophy view on inequality, which is to say, when we try to justify differences in income, some of it is justified because it results from the efforts that people made in order to gain a little more income, and this should not be corrected, this should not be compensated. And there are differences which come from the fact that people were raised in different family backgrounds and during the lifetime were confronted with different circumstances which were completely beyond their control. So what is behind the control of people should be compensated for. Those differences should be compensated because they are not due to what people decided to do, but principles of freedom, principles of individual responsibility recommend that inequality due to efforts should not be eliminated. And we could call that a liberal view to inequality, although some radical people are definitely on that side. There is another view to inequality, which is the fact that inequality may be good or bad in moral terms, and we may want to reduce inequality because we believe that it is social justice to have less inequality. But there is also an instrumental view about inequality which says inequality is bad because it is reducing the economic efficiency of societies. And if we had less inequality, we would be able to produce more and then to make everybody better off. And this view is interesting, and if you try to get into the detail of that, then you find that inequality indeed may have an impact on economic efficiency, but it is mostly through the inequality of opportunity rather than through the inequality of incomes. It is through the inequality in the circumstances that are beyond the control of the people that there is some inefficiency in the economy. And as a result of that, if you follow that liberal view of inequality or that instrumental view of inequality, then the policy recommendation is you have to equalize opportunities rather than income. Besides, it is possible that if you want to equalize income through redistribution, you will be creating more inefficiency in the economy. And so what I want to analyze is this, and I want to show that, as a matter of fact, the two sides are to some extent extreme, and the only way you can look at both inequality of income and opportunities is by looking at them jointly rather than insisting only on one side of the coin. So I would like to very quickly look at 4 points. First, the issue of the measure of the inequality of opportunity, which is a big problem. Second, the impact of the inequality of opportunity on economic efficiency. What is the kind of evidence that we have to support this argument, this instrumental argument that I mentioned before? Then I want to insist on the fact that equalizing opportunities in general will require equalizing incomes one way or another. So policies which will have as a goal to make opportunities more equal in society will be supported by resources which will have to be obtained through some kind of income redistribution. And I will end up with, as an example of the integration between inequality of opportunities and inequality of income, with what is now known as a Great Gatsby curve, which shows that you have to look at the two sides at the same time. Measuring the inequality of opportunity. This is where we have the direct link with social mobility. Indeed, when we think about circumstances which are beyond the control of the people, parents or the family background or the social background in which people were raised, which includes the schools where they went to, the friends they had in school, etc. All this is included in the measure of social mobility, which is relating the situation of the children, of grown-up today, with the situation of their parents. And there is a lot of analysis of intergenerational mobility, comparing people depending on who their parents were, the income they got, the wealth they had, the schooling they had, their social status, etc. Now, one criterion which is very frequently used when we look at the intergenerational elasticity of income, intergenerational mobility of income, is this concept of elasticity, which measures by how much by what percentage the earnings of children will be increased if the earnings of the parents or the income of the parents is increased by 1%. So it is a relationship between, if you compare two individuals with parents which differ in terms of income by 1%, what is the expected difference in the earnings of the children? Now, it is very difficult to get this kind of information in terms of income, because you need to have data on income across generations, and those data are seldom available. The same thing about wealth. It is slightly easier to look at educational mobility, and some people are also looking at social status, but because of the fact that you need to observe people when they are kids and when they are grown-ups, of course, mobility will not be the same if you look people when they are 25 and you look at their parents, or when they are in their 50s and you look at their parents. So all this means that there is a lot of difficulty in getting this kind of information. This is the reason why another way of measuring social mobility is simply to look at what is the variance, what is that part of differences in the earnings of the present generation, which can be explained by the social background. What we just heard about this survey in Mexico, this retrospective survey, is typically this kind of thing. And then you can look at what share of the existing inequality can be explained by the inequality of the parents. And this is, of course, a measure of social mobility. And the last one is to look not at grown-ups, not at people in their 30s or 40s, and asking them who were your parents and how much they earned and what was their socioeconomic status, but to look at children today and to look at the performance of school achievements of children today depending on their parents. So is it the case, how much of differences in test scores, for example in the PISA experiment, can be explained by the characteristics of the parents of the students. This is already giving us some information about social mobility that goes, as it was emphasized before, through education. So here are some figures on that. Here you have the intergenerational elasticity of earnings for cohorts which were born more or less in the early 60s and which were observed in their 40s, meaning that they were observed in the early 2000s. And some people have tried to put together, those data to make international comparisons. And what is interesting in that chart is a huge difference that you find across those developed countries that you have here. On the left-hand side, you have the Nordic countries, Denmark, Sweden, Norway, Finland, where you see that the elasticity is very low, meaning that social mobility is high because parents don't weigh very, very much in the earnings of the children. But on the other hand, you have countries like the US, Italy, UK, which are at the top. France is not very far from them, and Germany might be more on the side of the Nordic. Now, we have to insist on the fact that those data refer to one cohort of people. It may be the case that if we were to repeat this kind of exercise with a younger cohort, a 10-year older cohort, we will find different results. We have very, very little information or evidence on the way in which those measures of social mobility are changing over time. This is typically the kind of retrospective analysis done. This is the share of the inequality which is due to observed circumstances, essentially family background, on the inequality of earnings. And you cannot read the identity of the countries, which is on the vertical axis. On the horizontal axis, you simply have the share of total inequality of earnings, which can be traced back to the characteristics of the parents in this kind of survey. And you see that it goes from a few percentage points at the top, and at the top you must find Denmark again, and Norway and Finland and Sweden, they are still there, so this is consistent with the previous chart. And at the bottom, you have developing countries this time. The country at the very bottom is Guatemala, and just above Guatemala you have Brazil, and in fact in general you'll find Latin American countries in the bottom of that chart. So this is a kind of data that we have on household, on opportunity index for children. There is a report which was published not a long time ago by the World Bank on Latin America, which is about this. But the problem with social mobility is that this is only one part of the circumstances that are beyond the control of the people. Throughout a lifetime, people may find circumstances which will influence very much their income generating capacity. There may be labor market discrimination if you are coming from some ethnic group, if you are a woman rather than a man. And this indeed is something beyond the control of the people and which will generate an inequality in income, inequality of opportunities, because those people cannot have the same set of possibilities than the other. Access to credit, the kind of friends, the fact that some people naturally have monopoly power or eventually through corruption or through some concentration of political power, insecurity, access to justice, all this is not decided by the people. This is something which is imposed upon them, or an advantage that they were able, that they got because of their relationship with the elite or with the political power, and this is part of the inequality of opportunities, and this is not reflected at all in social mobility. So we have to consider that in terms of inequality of opportunities, social mobility is only giving us a lower bound in the estimation of the inequality of opportunities. But something which is quite important for analysis is the fact that there is no comprehensive, there cannot be a comprehensive measure of the inequality of opportunity in the same way as we are measuring the income inequality using the Gini or some other coefficient. It will be, and it is fundamentally extremely difficult to put all those dimensions of circumstances together and to get one index saying this country has more inequality of opportunity than this other country, or the inequality of opportunity in that country is increasing over time. And this is something very important because we cannot do the kind of cross-country comparison using the inequality of opportunity to see what is the impact. Evidence on the impact of the inequality of opportunity on economic efficiency. Here, I'm afraid to say that the only kind of evidence that we have is microeconomic evidence. I mean, it is completely obvious that people who have not access to credit will not have the same possibilities of generating income in their life as people who had some wealth to start with or because of some other reasons can easily access credit. So this we can measure because we can look at the behavior of people, behavior of small entrepreneurs, look at the rate of return to their investment, understand or find that the rate of return is much higher for those people, meaning that it will be profitable for them to borrow from the credit market, and they cannot do it. So this is obvious. Access to quality education. It is obvious. This is probably the most obvious inefficiency of inequality of opportunities. Talented children may not make it, as we have just seen, to the university simply because the parents cannot afford this. Or maybe also because the parents don't have the culture corresponding to university education. And this is definitely a loss of efficiency because less talented kids are getting to Oxford and Cambridge, whereas more talented kids cannot go. So, and we can multiply the examples, and the literature is full of these examples. Now, the problem is that we can see that at the level of individuals. Now, it's very difficult to aggregate up and to say the fact that, as we have seen in UK, there is this kind of inequality of opportunities among children. What is the impact of that at the aggregate level on economic growth in UK? There is no way. I mean, we don't know because not only we should be measuring the loss of efficiency at the individual level, but we should also take into account the fact that there are externalities in the society, and better educated society of better educated people is more than the sum of better educated people. And because of that, we cannot say because of this, because of that, the UK, France, Mexico is losing so much of aggregate output. Standard panel cross-country analysis is difficult, as just said, because you cannot compare countries country, saying this country has more social mobility or less inequality of opportunity and is growing faster than the others. This is a kind of comparison that we cannot make, so there is no macro evidence on this. Because of that, people are using very often income inequality and trying to see whether income inequality is getting or is producing more or less economic growth or more or less economic efficiency. And if you look at this literature, you could say, yes, income inequality to some extent is a proxy for income, the inequality of opportunities. And as a matter of fact, we find that there is a negative correlation between inequality and growth. This is something that was said in the previous session. But we have to remember that this is only a proxy. And because of that, we are not sure about the interpretation that we should be given to this kind of finding. If we find that more income inequality is reducing the rate of growth of an economy, if what is behind that is the inequality in education, then we should not equalize incomes. We should equalize education in order to grow faster. So the way in which this kind of evidence has to be, is to be interpreted is very unclear. Now, my third point is the following, that let's say that we are convinced that equalizing opportunities is good per se for ethical reasons, but also is instrumentally good because it is increasing the efficiency of an economy. Then how will we equalize opportunities? You cannot redistribute human capital. You cannot take education from somebody and give it to somebody else. This is a dynamic process. In order to, in the case of education, in order to make the quality of education more uniform in a country, then the government must invest in better resources for the educational system, better teachers, etc., etc. Now, this is costing money. And in order to equalize education, quality, and therefore opportunities in the society, we need to rely on taxation. Now, of course, the taxation must be progressive because we don't want to help people who are sending their kids today in low-quality schools. We want to improve the quality of the school. We don't want at the same time to tax them so that the parents will spend less on the education of the children. So because of that, no more signal. Okay, now this one is working. Okay, fine. Mine is not working. So now I'm blind. Okay, so because of that, you need, in order to equalize opportunities, you need to have some income redistribution taking place. It's time to wrap up. Okay, this is true for all types of opportunity equalizing policies. I will simply insist on the last points in blue. So equalizing opportunities require redistributing income. We have to be aware of the fact that redistributing income may involve some efficiency loss, so that we have gains from equalizing opportunities, but possibly some loss of redistributing income, but good policies yield an economic surplus in the sense that the gain from more equal opportunities is more than the loss of financing this equalizing of opportunities through income redistribution. So this is the way in which income distribution or redistribution and equalizing opportunities are linked. But in this argument, I went from the equality of opportunities, I started from the equality of opportunities. And I say if we want to have opportunities more equal, then we need to redistribute income. But we could also go the other way and say if the distribution of income is very unequal, then most likely there will be some inequality of opportunities because through social mobility, and this is what we have seen since the beginning of this session, then there will be a transmission of inequality. And this is the meaning of this so-called Great Gatsby curve, which is relating on the horizontal axis the degree of income inequality in societies. And here you have the same group of countries as in my previous chart on social mobility. And on the vertical axis, you have social mobility. And what you observe here is that there is a clear correlation between the extent of social mobility and the degree of income inequality, or more exactly, the degree of income equality. You see that countries which are more unequal in income terms are countries where social mobility is lower. So the United States, which is more or less at the top of this chart, and United Kingdom is not very far, are countries where there is low social mobility and a rather high level of income inequality in comparison with other countries. And at the very bottom, you have the 4 Nordic countries where you have a very low level of income equality and a high level of social mobility. So this is the way in which we can see that both opportunities and inequality of income are intricately linked. If we want to make improvement, then we have to act on both sides of the coin. And I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias al profesor François.
Thank you very much, Professor François Bourguignon, for this excellent presentation that without a doubt is going to lead to a very interesting book, especially regarding the debate on equal opportunities and equal income. And that that helps us reach the point of the analysis. Without a doubt, we see that there is a need to advance in both directions. We need to correct both the income and opportunities. It is a very complex analysis that the professor just presented, and without a doubt, it is going to generate very important reflections on your part. We have very little time for the Q&A session. I would just like to make a comment to Professor Bourguignon, whether it would be possible or feasible to distinguish the roots that would divide, if possible, and if it's necessary. What would be the route in terms of political intervention in order to create equal opportunities and equal income? What would be the pathway in developed countries and in underdeveloped countries? Because this contrast, when translated into public policies, might help with these national initiatives. Maybe all of these could reach a better outcome. And Katrina, thank you very much. Just a couple of questions. One, where is it that the Commission has the greatest impact as a consulting organism? Where is that impact reflected the most? And also a question regarding the youth population and the children population, those that are at the greatest disadvantage. The role of the immigration in the United Kingdom and in Europe, that is going to add on to those factors or those population groups that are at a disadvantage? Or is there no special distinction between the populations in terms of migration? And I had already mentioned a little bit about that with Enrique. I'll leave you with those comments. And if you want, we will open the microphones for 3 questions. And then we will continue on with our panel experts. We have one over there. Yes, thank you very much. My name is Maria Antonieta Garcia Larscurain. I'm from the Union of Teachers. For those of us working in education, the fact that all of these debates end up in education education, well, it is a big deal to us. But I don't believe that we should throw the education, especially formal education, because all of us are educators in a way. We shall not throw the whole responsibility to higher education, the responsibility of improving the situation, and especially this situation with the stagnant mobility. Without a doubt, education is fundamental. But I believe, just as it was mentioned here, that there are other contributing aspects in this process. And in particular, in the case of Mexico, the data from OECD show that higher education does not result in a higher return for young people. We also know that the economic crisis in Europe have left many young people without a job, even if they had a master degree or PhD. So the responsibility of these public policies, especially the ones that were mentioned here, regarding income, regarding the redistribution of income and taxation, those are fundamental in this debate. On the other hand, I also believe that the equalization of opportunities in education has not had that great leap. It is not only merit and talent that is graded. Hundreds of thousands of young people in our country cannot achieve a 9 or a 10, the A. However, those children deserve an opportunity, and public policies are still granting scholarships and support only based on that grade. And that is going to set those grades are going to be set sometimes because of the background of the candidate. Therefore, I would like to hear from Dr. Bourguignon regarding these aspects. Thank you very much. Here we have another question in the front. Thank you very much. My name is Oscar Garcia Manzano. I'm an economist, psychologist, sociologist, and even if it sounds weird, I'm a private investigator. I don't belong to any university. I do my own research for 15 years now. The curve that was presented by the first lecturer regarding education and income, it is something that I have tested internationally with 174 countries, and it coincides that starting the 9th year of education, it takes off this curve. However, when we analyze these same curves in developed countries, we realize that they stabilize between 13 and 14.5 years of age, and if we go all the way to infinitum, all the way to 100 years, in the case of Japan, they stop growing. Therefore, they remain between 13.5 and 14.5 years of education, that is. Why? Why, I wondered. Why is it that they get stable after that point? Well, I dare say, I dare believe that it is because there is a graduate degree. This means in developed countries, people continue on learning as they are working. And this graduate study is, in a way, education that they receive while working. So the education continues. This growth in income, that is where we are right now in Mexico. We are in that point, in those 9 years of studies. And in theory, we shall see an increase linked to it. We are well above 36 other countries that are between 8.5 to 9.5 years of education, and we are above everyone except for 2 countries who export oil, Spain and Portugal. But we are above the rest of the countries. If can you please go a little quicker? Yes, if economic policies, given all of this information, if economic policies and education policies, and it is a long-term economic policy, if the short-term policies included or focused on the type of work that is required today, because in Mexico 82% of the people who work have a high school degree or less. Therefore, the type of work that we require are works for people with a high school degree or less. So maybe taking into account those elements, wouldn't that yield better results than the results that we have? Instead of looking in theory those works with better salaries that we cannot cover. A shorter question next, please. And we will close the Q&A. Hi, good evening. I would like to ask Professor Enrique whether he considers that in order to have better wealth distribution, that the path that the federal government has chosen is to whether the path is to have an economic integration with developed countries, just like the link that we have with the United States through the free trade agreement. Because the argument that they propose is that there is better exportation rates, more trade of raw material. But if we see the consequences of the free trade agreement, we can see that there is being a decrease in national production, an increase in imports, and a very clear example is corn. Therefore, and there is a huge gap, for instance, that was created between the northern part of the country and the central and southern part of the country. The northern part of the country was benefited the most by the free trade agreement, and the other areas were not as benefited. So would you consider this option the ideal option to reach better equality in wealth distribution? Thank you. Now we are going to welcome to invite our panelists to share their opinions on these matters. Well, I believe that it is very interesting. Without a doubt, we need to go together in terms of opportunity, equality, and also income equality. They go together without a doubt. And regarding some of the questions that you posed for indigenous populations in the year 2006, in our survey we included a special module for them. And yes, what we see is that they are at a disadvantage at a national level, indigenous populations. We still need to analyze the social migration part. We haven't analyzed the migration part, and we hope that in the following surveys we analyze that further. And regarding that last question, well, I think, regarding the free trade agreements and so on, I believe that it's kind of expecting something unexpected. Free trade agreements are what they are, free trade agreements. It is not a political agreement, it is not an agreement regarding other things, but what we do need is compensating policies. What it means is that we need policies that in a way decrease the polarization effects that might arise from it. In that sense, I do believe that certain things were taken into account when the free trade agreement was made. For instance, the automotive area, automotive sector had some integration rules, but other sectors were not as active. So I don't see a problem as such in the free trade agreement, but I would see the problem where what we do on top of that or in addition to that, and we need to foresee the consequences of such a situation. I would target it that way. If anybody is interested in the report, you can bring me your ID card and I can send it through email, that report. Catriona, do you have any comments? Yeah.
The impact of the Social Mobility Commission, I think, for its first couple of years, it made quite a large impact. For instance, the media were incredibly interested in the annual report. We produced 2 annual reports, State of the Nation, and the BBC covered it extensively. So one of the impacts was to mobilize the public. And I think the issues of politics and public opinion, that's one of the directions of the Commission's work. I wouldn't like to overstate it, but I think we were very pleased that, as I said at the end of the presentation, that the Prime Minister at the Conservative Party conference did say, this is an issue for us. Now, the words social mobility hadn't really been talked about, and in fact the Commission, the UK being comprised of 4 jurisdictions, the Commission went to Scotland and to Wales to say, actually, social mobility is being talked about in England, what about Wales and Scotland? So it's spread in that respect. The issue about the young being disadvantaged in the way in which the financial crisis over the period has happened has that raised a debate about where public policy was putting its money. In the UK, the pensioners were protected over the last few years. Perhaps the most interesting impacts have been around the work outside of government, and I think this is, typical in terms of politics. Governments are always quite pleased if you're asking other people to do things, not government. So the businesses, we have made quite a lot of progress with not only the elite employers, I mentioned the accountants and the lawyers, but also the employers of low wage, the low wage staff, the big supermarket chains, Asda, I think it's Walmart, it's in the States. These chief executives were suddenly aware of what their practices were doing in relation to their staff. So I think that's an area that is actually ripe for pushing forward, and we did achieve a living wage commitment as well from the UK government. So those are the impacts. Very quickly, immigration, you mentioned. I can't go into detail because I haven't researched it myself, but the London phenomenon was actually the educational outcomes were partly attributed as well to very positive immigration. Young people coming into London aspiring to be educated. So there's a positive, there's also a very negative side to that, and I think it's one of those areas that does need to be really looked at in depth. Finally, just on education, I do agree with the lady who spoke about teachers. I actually myself was slightly disappointed that we focus on education. It's almost like with statistics, isn't it? You focus on what you can measure. 20% of outcomes educationally for children in the UK are to do with schools, 80% to do with parenting and environment and all the other factors. And I think that's where we actually need to make more progress.
Muchas gracias. Profesor Bourguignon, para cerrar su segunda jornada.
Thank you very much. Monsieur Bourguignon, in order to close this last session, yes, 2 points. In order to answer your question, Dr. Guillen, regarding the difference in terms of social mobility or opportunity inequality or inequity in those countries that are developed and underdeveloped. Well, we have very little evidence in order to do a comparison, mainly because we don't have data that can be comparable in order to do that. But being speculatory, I believe that there is reason to think that social mobility depends of the level of development and the growth rate. When you see a country where the growth rate is very fast, there are opportunities, without a doubt, that arise in the economy. And because of that, we can expect more mobility. On the same token, when you look at education, the progress that has been attained in Mexico or in developed countries in terms of education, education is focused on the basic ground, and they're based on the distribution in terms of socioeconomic status. And it wants to promote in the future better social mobility. There are many reasons, therefore, why right now it's not surprising that social mobility, as measured, is less important in those countries who are getting developed, and that can change in time. And just as I mentioned in my presentation, I believe that social mobility is something that changes in time. In the United States, for instance, I am completely convinced that social mobility in the beginning of the 20th century probably is different. Probably in the beginning of the 19th century, it was different because of the immigrant population and all of the opportunities that were being raised, and that led to growth in the United States. Now, regarding the opportunities in education, it is true that it is very attractive to talk about education when you talk about social mobility and opportunity inequality, because it is something that we understand very well and we can measure it in a way. But I don't want to say, I don't want to believe that that's the only dimension. Wealth and the transmission of wealth from one generation to the next is something that is very important. That has been very well shown in the book by my colleague, Dr. Napitieti, and he showed that the weight of, how do you say it? The weight of inheritance is increasing very much in developed countries, and that is going to be part of the reason for opportunity inequality. And in the case of education, there is something very interesting. Education, a couple of years ago, we did this analysis in the case of Brazil about the income or the salaries, and depending on their education level and depending on the parents' characteristics. And the very important point is that once you control for education, you still see that the characteristics of the parents have a huge weight. This means that education does not have the same weight, or it means that when those young people enter the labor market, there is a huge social network that can help them and also plays a part in this opportunity inequality, and it is going to appear as a social measure. But just to wrap up, it is a field where we don't know much, simply because the data is insofar very scarce. And I need to tell you that I was very happy to hear Dr. Cárdenas presenting that data on Mexico, because we don't have that much data. Thank you. We would like to thank our panel members for the extraordinary work presented here today. I was told that the buses are already outside if you need to take a bus. Thank you.